joining in this week. So I wanted to talk about chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia, and essentially how and where some of the roots to those disorders are. And so one of the things I really wanted to touch on was just kind of like the different type of roots that chronic fatigue syndrome has. So in order for most people, if they were ever diagnosed, a lot of people aren't necessarily diagnosed with it. They self-diagnose chronic fatigue syndrome. Mostly it's self-diagnosed after after going through the system, and having no answers. It's usually like a diagnosis of exclusion. Usually for chronic fatigue syndrome, people will have very big physical exertion after exercise, body pain, lowered immune system. They will have difficulty awakening in the morning. And so I just wanted to tap into the root causes of chronic fatigue syndrome, because there's and some what the research says and ways you can help yourself with this. So it's important to understand that with chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia, this is a very multi-rooted, often issue. Okay, usually the roots of chronic fatigue syndrome are not typically addressed in the medical realm. This is a little bit more in depth. These types of cases and individuals are a little bit more in depth to work with, because there's multiple roots from the causes of what's going on. So most often, the things that research-based and what I see in clinical practice that are aligned with chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia are number one, mold toxicity. So mold toxicity, if a patient has been in and around an environment with dampness, mold, this is a very big root cause of chronic fatigue syndrome, and one that needs to be absolutely addressed. And you can do that. There are specific tests that I do with patients that are mycotoxin tests. So they're urine tests that check for specific mold mycotoxins that the mold spores actually produce. And so more often, there's actually a great research article that shows like patients with chronic fatigue syndrome and a study with patients that were normal, healthy, and then patients with chronic fatigue, and it showed that, and they did a mycotoxin test on both of them, and 90% of the chronic fatigue syndrome patients tested positive for mold, and 0 of the healthy tested positive for the mycotoxins. So it's really important, if you are somebody with chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia, that you absolutely want to rule out a number of root causes. Okay, so that is one that's heavily linked to chronic fatigue syndrome. Okay, another one is trauma. Obviously, I talk about this a lot. Chronic fatigue syndrome or abuse. If you are currently, and this is something that's a little bit more insidious, is if you are in or have been in an emotionally abusive relationship. Not a lot of people understand 100% what emotional abuse is versus things like, sexual abuse or physical abuse or neglect, things like that. Those are a little bit more in your face. They're a little bit more obvious. They have more tangible effects. Emotional and psychological abuse can absolutely lead to a lot of symptoms of chronic fatigue, and it's typically a form of dissociation, where a patient feels confused about they go into kind of like a spacey state, and they feel just like tired. and worn out. A lot of people, actually, a lot of women, there's studies that show women in abusive relationships or that have been in abusive relationships for a long time or emotionally abusive relationships do go on to develop chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia. And I truly believe that part of that is because of how much your system is in a fight or flight state, in the adrenal exhaustion, from being in an abusive relationship and feeling like you're on edge all the time, and having uh, there's a lot of health issues that come from that. So that is a big root. That is one that is a really tough root, and that's one that I think that it's really hard, to tiptoe around in the medical world. Um, it's kind of hard to ask somebody straight out, hey, are you in an abusive relationship? And if you're not sure or familiar with what emotional abuse is, or you're not, it's very covert, or there's, it's not somebody who's super close to you, but, it's not your spouse, but it's a friend or whatever, a relative, um, you know, there's aspects of that can create severe emotional exhaustion, and confusion for patient, anxiety, depression. That is a very insidious type of abuse that can create and lead to chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia as well, because there are physiological effects from the sympathetic nervous system and fight or flight system being on and trying to keep you in a protection mode all the time. So abuse, chronic abuse or trauma can actually be, a big root as well. Another root cause of, chronic fatigue syndrome is leaky gut. So leaky gut is something that's considered more hyperpermeability in the GI tract. So over time, what can happen is your system, if your GI tract gets broken down from having a poor diet, and if you are somebody with, abuse, you may have been somebody who had, poor eating or addictions, or, financial difficulties to buy good quality food. This can go definitely in hand with leaky gut as well, because leaky gut, basically, if you get the destruction of the gastrointestinal barrier, which is literally one cell layer thick, you're eating a lot of non-organic foods, you're going to use the traditional medicine and get antibiotics a lot. These things can all really break down the epithelial of the gastrointestinal tract. What can happen here is that, it can lead to hyperpermeability of the GI tract. And what happens is, over time, your body starts having immune responses to large molecules that get through the gut lining. So they get, say you're taking in a specific type of food. I've seen this a lot on patients with food allergy testing. All of a sudden, they're noticing their fatigue gets way worse after eating specific types of food. And they're like, I had a food allergy panel and this and that. Nothing really came up. I'm like, but did you have a food sensitivity panel? And did you check for, specific things that could reveal leaky gut? So what ends up happening is, because of the hyperpermeability of the GI tract, those large molecules end up seeping through into the bloodstream, and your body starts having an immune and inflammatory response to those specific molecules. So now your body, with whatever you eat, or if you're taking in, unhealthy foods or toxins or anything like that, it could even be a healthy food. Like, I've seen people come up with food sensitivities to bananas, to basil, to peppermint. Um, it can be one of those things where, you're seeing a ton of food sensitivities pop up on a panel, and, I run an IgA, secretory IgA on the gastrointestinal tract, and lo and behold, the person's SIGA is off the chart. They have half of their foods they're getting immunities to, and so what's happening is everything in the patient's system is getting an immune response and an inflammatory response. So it's kicking off like an autoimmune effect. Okay, that's another type of root, to chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia. Now, there is also a neurological level of this. So patients with, you know, with fibromyalgia have, potentially more excitation of the nervous system in general. So they're getting an override of pain fibers that are, they're like the body. Pain is really pain is perception. Okay, let me start there. If your nervous system and you have a ton of inflammation, or a heavy toxin, say you have a heavy neurotoxin, you have a mercury toxicity or something. Um, that is something, especially if you have leaky gut, typically you have more hyperpermeability of the brain and central nervous system as well, of like the meninges. And essentially, what we're talking about is you can also get inflammation of the brain as well. Okay, so in speaking of not just leaky gut, but patients who have fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue, you can actually get like the brain fog, things like that. You can have absolute autoimmune responses to specific parts of your brain, and inflammation that can create a lot of these symptoms as well. And specific types of heavy metals, particularly things like lead and mercury, can create a lot of these problems. Excuse me. So remember that pain is also a perception. So it's basically you're getting your nerve fibers being a lot more susceptible to that stimulation and lighting up parts of your brain that's pain. Um, so that can be more in specific, excuse me, um, that can be more significant in people with heavy toxicities and heavy metals. Um, so it's interesting. People also have, more hyperpermeability when they have taken in a high level of toxins as well, because that can break down the barriers as well. But as far as chronic fatigue goes, the biggest things, the biggest roots to look for again, is the whether or not the patient is in or has been in an abusive relationship, especially emotionally, and or trauma when they were young, mold toxicity, specific heavy metals, mercury, lead, and toxins as well. The other thing you want to consider is like leaky gut and the immune response and the inflammatory response in the body. The other thing to think about too is, and that's linked to it, is malabsorption. So if you have, and like typically, somebody who's got a high level of inflammation and all these things, there's so many layers to peeling this away, but the big heavy roots are typically the heavier toxins, the mold toxicity, and then the emotional abuse aspect of it, or some sort of type of abuse or trauma that it's rooted in with chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia. Um, so if you are somebody who is experiencing this, one thing that I would suggest is, if you have ever been to a doctor, first of all, and I feel like this contributes to it because I've seen a lot of patients come in with actual um, well-meaning doctors that say like, "Hey, I'm not sure what to do. I don't specialize in this. I don't know how to help." And then there's patients who have gone from physician to physician and kind of been beaten down by the system as well, which is contributing to exhaustion. And I've heard patients tell me stories of how their own physicians were kind of like gaslighting them and blaming them for their health conditions. And knowing that this does happen is like, it's so aggravating and it's so sad to hear this. Patients that their physician says it's all in your head or you just need to lose weight, or kind of like blaming them for their condition. Um, Instead of just being like, I don't know, we can try this to see if this will help. I'm not really sure what the specific cause is to this, or you might want to go consider seeing this person. Instead of telling a patient, like, this is all in your head, like, you need to stop worrying about this, you need to stop, or just kind of like generally invalidating the patient's concerns. This is such like an invisible fight for a lot of patients. It's hard for people to understand that, okay, look, it's extremely hard for me to get out of bed in the morning and then make it through the day. Like I can't not lay down. You know what I mean? Um, so that's really hard to explain to somebody. And because it's kind of invisible. There's not like, oh, I'm having a skin issue. Look at my skin. It's all, you know what I mean? Or I'm having an infection. It's literally just like these vague symptoms, that are perception kind of based. Fatigue doesn't get taken seriously as much. Um, two more roots I wanted to talk about. One of them is mitochondrial dysfunctions and specific genetic variants in malabsorption. So, a lot of times, patients with mitochondrial dysfunction mitochondria are the powerhouse of your cells. They're where your body converts most of your energy that in your food absorption, from whether it's carbs, fats, proteins. Um, your body will go through a process of trying to convert energy. And so, if you have mitochondrial dysfunction and you are missing specific B vitamins, B1, B2 specifically, um, you know, there's a bunch of different vitamins that are needed for this process. So, if you are having trouble with malabsorption, you're having trouble with either getting enough of these vitamins in, your diet is poor, or you have mitochondria that's overrun with shunting your energy towards chronic disease. So, patients with chronic Epstein Barr, their immune system's low, they have an autoimmune issue. And their body is unable to fight off a specific virus, or they have a heavy viral load that can create a lot of chronic fatigue symptoms as well. So it's really important. Like, usually when I'm working with patients such as this, it's really important to do a very big diversity. I do a great panel called the NutriVal panel with people with like heavier testing that really shows me how their carbohydrate, fat, and protein metabolisms are working, what nutrients they're deficient in, how their mitochondria is functioning, what their inflammatory levels are. This test, it's like, I love this test. It's such a powerful one, especially for patients with chronic fatigue, because it allows us to see and go really deep into the functionality of the energy system in the body. So, a lot of times with chronic fatigue people, definitely we're going to see a mixture of mitochondrial dysfunction, and then some sort of issue with, like, if there's a high viral load, or there's a toxicity somewhere, like a heavy metal toxicity somewhere. If there's no mold toxicity, or histories of trauma, things like that, I'm thinking, okay, there's definitely some sort of like processing of energy, malabsorption, potentially autoimmune type thing going on, right? And another one of the last roots is chronic Lyme disease. So, chronic Lyme is um, very challenging. And for any of you who have considered that you have chronic Lyme disease, this weekend I'm actually speaking in the Chronic Lyme Disease Summit. I will post that link below in case you want to check that out, and how basically chronic stress dampens your immunity and how it can prolong um, getting better with chronic Lyme disease. But patients can have chronic Lyme disease for, 10 years, 20 years. Like, it's honestly, you get bit by a tick, you never get treatment. There's kind of stages of it, but chronic Lyme disease can actually mimic chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia very much. You can get burning of your legs, you can get a lot of exhaustion. Your levels of exhaustion are very high with chronic Lyme disease. So, it's important to really tease out what some of the roots are with these things. Again, they could be layered. You could have a multitude. You could have all of these root causes that need to be worked to and layered, or you could have one or two, right? But those are the things that typically are more in alignment with chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia. Um, and there's also talk of, like, I talk about burnout, the emotional exhaustion piece that's linked to abuse or even like codependency and emotional roots can actually lead also. That's a root that kind of leads up to adrenal fatigue. Adrenal fatigue and adrenal, like HPA axis dysfunction, happens in a states of chronic stress. So whether or not that happened a long time ago and your brain kind of adapted to that, or if you're consistently in this high pressure state with high stress, that is usually, I haven't mentioned that because that's usually rooted in um, trauma or codependency patterns or emotional abuse kind of stuff. So I hope you guys find that helpful. If you get time, I would absolutely love for you guys to check out the Chronic Lyme Disease Summit. I know a lot of the doctors, or some of the doctors who are speaking, and Dr. Jay Davidson is actually a specialist. Him and Todd Watts, Dr. Todd Watts, are specialists within this realm. And especially Dr. Jay Davidson, and he really delivers a lot of value and unconventional knowledge that can be really beneficial if you're experiencing these types of issues. So I'm going to invite you to check that out. I'm sure you will not be disappointed. You will learn a lot. Um, and if you need help in specifics, I do work with patients with these types of issues and health coaching and functional testing virtually. So I'd be happy to work with you if you feel like you need some extra assistance or would like to delve into some of the testing, and you're kind of one of those people who, you know what, you're tired of running through the system and you're not getting the answers that you need. um, I'd love to help and be a reference for you to get more answers and get in a good direction with your healing process. So um, I'm Dr. Misty Kosciuszko. Thank you so much for watching today. If this video was helpful for you, please like and comment below. Let me know how I can help in further posts, and I will see you guys next week. Don't forget to check out the Chronic Lyme Disease Summit. Bye.